From the mid-7th century to the 20th century, Arab traders primarily transported enslaved people across the Sahara, with most of the slaves being taken from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa to be sold to the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations. It is estimated that between 6 and 10 million black slaves were taken from sub-Saharan Africa to the Arab world, with about 7 million slaves crossing the Sahara, and the rest slaves moved in the opposite direction. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade was managed by Arabs with the active involvement from Berbers. During this period, black Africans, Turks, Iranians, Europeans and Berbers were also traded throughout the Arab world, and particularly in Western Asia, North Africa, East Africa, and parts of Europe. After the 8th century Arab conquest of North Africa, Arabs and Berbers ventured into sub-Saharan Africa, pursuing the trans-Saharan trade, particularly in slaves, as there was constant demand for enslaved labor in Eastern Arab nations and Constantinople. Slaves were often captured through violent raids and forced on perilous marches across the Sahara to be sold in slave markets, where they were treated as chattel, personal property to be bought and sold. In North Africa, the main slave markets were in Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli and Cairo, and sales were held in public places such as souks. Aside from raiding, slaves could also be obtained by purchasing them from local black rulers. Few African rulers would resist the slave trade, while many chiefs would become middlemen in the trafficking, rounding up members of nearby villages to be sold to visiting merchants. Some black Africans also participated in slave raiding. Kingdoms looking to expand their territories would often invade their neighbors, take them as slaves, and carry them off to their own lands to sell them by the dozens to the merchants. Every year, great numbers of them were sent off to the Western Maghreb. Muslim merchants also employed various tactics to capture and enslave black people, with some merchants reportedly luring Zanj children using dates, enticing them from place to place until they were captured, taken out of their homeland, and transported to foreign lands. Muslim traders often referred to the African populations they enslaved as Zanj or Sudan, meaning black. The routes taken by slave caravans varied based on their destination. Slaves bound for Egypt were transported by boat along the Nile, while those heading to Arabia were sent to Red Sea ports like Suakin and Asab. Slaves destined for North Africa traveled via the ancient Saharan trade routes, in use since around 1000 BC, such as the Tripoli-Ghadames-Gat-Hoga-Gao route that linked modern Libya to Nigeria, or the Tripoli-Fezzan-Bornu route that connected Libya to present-day Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. There were also other key routes that connected Egypt to Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The Kanem-Bornu-Zawila route was vital for North African trade, with the Kanem-Bornu Empire playing a significant role in the trans-Saharan slave trade, which contributed to its wealth. Passage through the Sahara required the expertise of ethnic groups whose lifestyles were uniquely adapted for survival in scorching, arid environments, namely the local Berber tribes and the foreign Bedouins from Arabia. Oases were vital way stations for caravans. The Tuareg and others who were indigenous to Libya facilitated, taxed, and partly organized the trade from the south along the trans-Saharan trade routes. Various nomadic peoples played critical roles as guards, guides, and camel drivers. As a result, they were granted autonomy and treated as allies by governments of North Africa. Despite this expertise, the journey across the desert was perilous, and entire caravans could vanish. The trans-Saharan trade involved the exchange of goods like food and clothing coming into Africa, while slaves, gold, and coconuts were exported. In the 16th century, Moroccan traders brought horses, European cloth, sugar, books, and brass vessels to Sudan in exchange for slaves, civet cats, and gold. The Sultan of Bornu, however, only accepted horses in exchange for slaves with rates as high as 1 slave per 20 horses. Slaves were assigned various tasks, including servile labor in irrigation, pastoralism, mining, transport, public works, proto-industry, and construction. Most black slaves were used as laborers, servants, or eunuchs, and in military roles. Female slaves were generally employed in domestic work and concubinage, while eunuchs, valued at 7 times the price of non-castrated males, served as harem guards, administrators, tutors, secretaries, commercial agents, and even concubines. Due to Islamic restrictions on castration, slaves were often castrated before being transported across the Sahara or after purchase in North African markets. Conditions for slaves in mining, particularly in Basra's salt mines, were notoriously harsh, leading to the Zanj rebellion. Both male and female slaves were also used in Egypt's copper mines, and the Carmatian Republic of Eastern Arabia reportedly employed 30,000 black slaves for labor. In medieval Muslim culture, blackness became increasingly associated with slavery, a belief often justified by a specific interpretation of the biblical story of the curse of Ham. This interpretation suggested that Ham's descendants were cursed with black skin and destined for slavery. Muslim slave traders used this rationale to justify the enslavement of black people, including black Muslims. In the late 14th century, a black king of Bornu wrote to the Sultan of Egypt, protesting against the frequent slave raids by Arab tribesmen that were devastating his lands and enslaving his Muslim population. In Al-Andalus, black Muslims could legally be held as slaves despite Islamic law forbidding the enslavement of any Muslim, regardless of race. Even into the 19th century, many in Islamic societies believed that enslavement based on skin color rather than religion was supported by religious laws. By the late 16th century, due to instability caused by Moroccan invasions of the Songhai Empire, former slave routes had shifted, replacing the Songhai route with new ones like the Benghazi-Wadai route through Sudan. After Europeans settled in the Gulf of Guinea, the Arab Trans-Saharan Slave Trade declined in importance. Slavery was a part of the economic structure of African societies for many centuries, although the extent varied. Systems of servitude and slavery were once commonplace in parts of Africa, as they were in much of the rest of the ancient and medieval world. Slavery in historical Africa was practiced in many different forms. Chattel slavery, a form of servitude where slaves are treated as the personal property of their owner, who is free to sell, trade, or exploit them like any other possession. The children of the slaves, who were often born into slavery, remained the property of the master. Debt bondage was another form of servitude, where individuals were pledged as collateral for loans. In West Africa, this system allowed debtors or their relatives, often children, to work off a debt. While related to slavery, pawnship or debt bondage typically included limited terms of service and protection through family ties, preventing the person from being sold into slavery. This practice was common among the Akan, Ewe, Ga, Yoruba, and Edo peoples of West Africa. Military slavery involved conscripting and training slaves as soldiers, where the slave soldiers were managed by a patron, who could be a ruler or warlord, using them for his financial and political gain. Slavery for domestic and court purposes was widespread throughout Africa. Plantation slavery also occurred, primarily on the eastern coast of Africa and in parts of West Africa. The importance of domestic plantation slavery increased during the 19th century due to the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. Human sacrifices, particularly of slaves, was also prevalent in West Africa, especially in the 18th and 19th century. The most infamous example was the annual customs of Dahomey, where 500 slaves were sacrificed. Human sacrifices also occurred along the West African coast and in the Benin Empire, as well as in small states in what is now southern Nigeria. In sub-Saharan Africa, the slave relationships were often complex, with rights and freedoms given to individuals held in slavery and restrictions on sale and treatment by their masters. Many communities had hierarchies between different types of slaves. For example, differentiating between those who had been born into slavery and those who had been captured through war. The forms of slavery in Africa were closely related to kinship structures. In many African communities, where land could not be owned, enslavement of individuals was used as a means to increase the influence a person had and expand connections. This made slaves a permanent part of a master's lineage, and the children of slaves could become closely connected with the larger family ties. Children of slaves born into families could be integrated into the master's kinship group and rise to prominent positions within society, even to the level of chief in some instances. However, stigma often remained attached, and there could be strict separations between slave members of a kinship group and those related to the master. In Africa, many slaves were involved in domestic slavery, working in the master's household while enjoying certain freedoms. Domestic slaves were considered part of the household and were rarely sold. They could earn profits from their labor, own land, marry, and pass assets to their children. In East Africa, the Christian kings of the Ethiopian Empire captured slaves primarily from the pagan Nilotic Shankela and Oromo peoples from their western borderlands, or from newly conquered or reconquered lowland territories. The Somali and Afar Muslim sultanates, such as the medieval Adal Sultanate, through their ports, also traded Zanj Bantu slaves captured from the hinterland. Slavery, as practiced in Ethiopia, was essentially domestic and was geared more towards women. This was the trend for most of Africa as well. Women were transported across the Sahara, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean, traded more than the slave men. Enslaved people served in the houses of their masters or mistresses and were not employed to any significant extent for productive purpose. The enslaved were regarded as second-class members of their owner's family. In Somalia, the inhabiting Bantus are descended from Bantu groups that had settled in Southeast Africa after the initial expansion from Nigeria to Cameroon, and whose members were later captured and sold into the Arab slave trade. From 1800 to 1890, over 50,000 Bantu slaves are thought to have been sold from the slave market of Zanzibar to the Somali coast, where most of the slaves were from the ethnic groups of Tanzania, Mozambique, and Malawi. Collectively, these Bantu groups are known as Mushunguli, which is a term taken from Mzigula, the Zigua tribe's word for people. The word holds multiple implied meanings including worker, foreigner, and slave. Bantu adult and children slaves, referred to collectively as Jarir by their Somali masters, were purchased in the slave market exclusively to do undesirable work on plantation grounds. Potential buyers made a careful examination of the merchandise. They checked the state of health of a person who was often standing naked with wrists bound together. While in Cairo, for instance, transactions involving eunuchs and concubine slaves happened in private houses where the prices of these slaves varied according to the slave's quality.